It's time for Talking Michigan Transportation, a podcast devoted to the conversations with people at the forefront of the ongoing mobility revolution. In the state that put the world on wheels, here's your host, MDOT Communications Director, Jeff Cranson.
Hi, once again, this is Jeff Cranson, and this is the Talking Michigan Transportation podcast. Today, I'm pleased to have a couple of guests with me. First, I'll be talking with Andy Dixon, who is a hydrologist for the National Weather Service in Grand Rapids, and presented on his findings and what the facts are related to high water in Michigan at a high water summit convened by the governor last month, involving multiple state agencies. And then next, I'll be talking to Brad Wieferich, who is the director of the Bureau of Development for MDOT, and that's the area that deals with designing projects and trying to factor in things like high water and what the toll is that it's taking on roads and bridges across the state. So first, I'm going to kick this off again with Andy Dixon. Andy, I appreciate you doing this. Let's get right into it and talk about what's going on and why there is so much water.
The big driver of it all is precipitation. And so that's where we start, and that's really what paints the picture in the most dramatic ways here. The state of Michigan as a whole is in the middle, as we sit here today, middle of the wettest 1 year, 3 year, and 5 year periods on record. And that's averaged across the entire state. So that's a truly remarkable and really unprecedented in the modern history. It goes back about 100 to 120 years. And so we really have not seen this type of situation before in terms of how much rain and snow is falling on the state of Michigan.
So when you say we haven't seen that before and it's unprecedented, that kind of I guess confronts any argument that this is just some typical cyclical thing that we've seen before.
Yeah, what I would clarify is that the modern records do only go back about 120 years. So farther back than that, you'd have to talk to somebody that specializes more in kind of the reconstruction of historic phenomena in the atmosphere. But yeah, certainly in the modern record era, this has not been seen before.
So, I'll talk later with Brad Wieferich, the Bureau of Development Director at MDOT that deals with the design and environmental considerations for all the projects, the state trunk lines, roads and bridges, and what the real impact is. But, beyond the tangible things that people can relate to, which are the roads that they drive on and, are very important to their daily lives, what other impacts are you seeing around the state?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of reports over the last year, really from one end of the state to the other, of everything from persistently higher river levels than normal, and I think we'll get into this a little more later, but what that tends to do is create impacts with scour of the riverbed or the dirt and sediment that's on the bottom of our rivers, and that can be a threat to infrastructure, including bridges, if it lasts for a long enough period of time.
Yeah, no, that's a big deal. Our head bridge engineer, Matt Chenoweth, talks about scour a lot, and Brad, even though I cautioned him against using that term in the media roundtable, he said it because that's the terminology engineers use. But
right.
could you explain scour, what that means?
Yeah, well, in its simplest form, the higher the water level is in one of our rivers, for example, like during a flood, not only will there be more water in the river, but the water will actually be flowing at a faster rate. And the reason that's important is because the speed with which water is flowing controls how much sediment, so this is sand and gravels and any other sediments that are making up the bottom or the sides of the river. The faster the water is flowing, the more of those little sediments and particles can get picked up and carried downstream.
And it just creates pressure on the piers of a bridge, right?
Right. That becomes a problem if you have infrastructure sitting in the water or depending on the riverbed or the river banks remaining in the same spot over long periods of time.
Yeah, and if it was designed and built expecting, a certain amount of pressure and nobody ever foresaw, what's going on now, it's something, I don't want to present the idea that that we're in some kind of danger, but it does require frequent inspections, and it's something that the bridge inspectors at all levels, state, county, and city, village, have to keep their eyes on.
Yeah, definitely, and it's sometimes hard to find numbers that can support this idea that we might be at increased risk for scour. But one of the ways that we can kind of look at that is by adding up the total amount of water that's being forced to flow down our rivers in a certain period of time. So when we started looking at how much water had flowed down the Grand River, for example, the Grand River at Grand Rapids, let's say, we can look at the long-term 100 to 110 years of water level history there and see that there's a certain amount of water that typically flows through the river in a 12-month period, the water year. Because scientists can never make anything easy, we don't line things up with the calendar year, we line them up with the fiscal year and call it water year. But regardless, during that 12-month period, there's a certain amount of water that typically flows down the Grand River at Grand Rapids. When we took a look at those numbers for this year, since October 1st of 2019, we were surprised to see that we hit that same mark for a year's worth of water. We hit it in just 4 months this year, so October through the end of January. And so what that can do is it gives us an indication that, holy cow, we need to do a double check on any of our infrastructure that is vulnerable to bridge scour, because we know we're sending a lot of water down the river and it's flowing faster for a longer period of time than it typically does.
So a lot of people in Grand Rapids and West Michigan are going to remember 2013 and the flooding year. Do we have any reason to believe that spring of this year, 2020, is going to be like that?
Well, I'm glad you asked. We have been anticipating, and we continue to have a higher than normal chance for flooding this spring. And you might wonder, well, how can that be? Now we've pretty much melted off all of the snow, at least for the southern two-thirds of lower Michigan. Certainly that is a good thing. Certainly that helps lessen our risk a little bit. But overall, because the soils are so saturated from all this rain that we've had, it really takes a long, prolonged period of drier than normal weather for some of the soil moisture to start trending back toward normal. So because the soil is full, we like to say the sponge is full. It can't hold as much as it typically would during the spring rains and snow melt. And so because of that, even though we don't have the snow, if we get into a pattern where we start to see rounds, especially multiple rounds of heavy rain, it's gonna be all hands on deck. We need to be careful. We need to be careful to pay attention, because the more water than normal is going to run right off into the rivers.
But was part of the phenomenon in 2013 the ice jams in Grand Haven at the channel?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look exactly. I know there wasn't a whole lot of snow on the ground or ice left in the rivers there in late April, but I think there could have been. That does sound familiar, that there was still some down there.
Yeah.
But really, the biggest driver was just the fact that there was a huge amount of water being forced down the river, even in the middle river areas like Ionia to Grand Rapids. There was still a very significant amount of water being pushed down the river. So even without any kind of ice effects that may have been happening down near Grand Haven and Robinson Township, it still would have been a significant flood.
So even with our largely sandy soils, the sponge can still only take so much.
Well, that's just it, because you talk about moisture in the soils, and that's true. The sandier soils are, the more they'll allow the water to soak in. But if you get so much rain for so long of a period of time that you start to raise the water table in an area, then you functionally can't take advantage of the fact that you have sandy soils, because they're just sitting there saturated all the time. We saw that up last summer. Mason and Lake counties in west central lower Michigan had a huge amount of rainfall in the second half of July. Actually set the state record for the most rain that's ever fallen in a 24-hour period. I think it was more than 12 inches of rain. And actually most of that even fell in an 8 or 10-hour period.
Wow.
What we saw is that even though they have the sandy soils there of northern lower Michigan, there was water just sitting in the woods, sitting in the swamps. Everything was full, even for weeks and months afterward. There was nowhere for it to go.
So I think one of your slides and part of your presentation kind of highlighted that this isn't necessarily about the severity of storms, but it's about the frequency. And you said that your slide showed that in a normal year we might have 12 to 20 events with waves of 10 feet or higher from fall and winter months. And just through January 21st of this year, we've already had 16. So I know this term is overused, but is this the new normal?
Yeah, right. It very well could be the new normal. It certainly seems to be the general weather pattern that we are locked into. Forecasting weeks to months in advance is, of course, a tricky proposition. We do our best, and what we're seeing is no reason to doubt that a general wet and warm pattern is going to continue into the spring and maybe even into the summer of 2020.
So, in meeting with people who do what you do, and talking to other folks, hydrologists and other people that study this science around the country, are there any kind of basic recommendations that you're making to the agencies that deal with these things? I mean, for MDOT, it means thinking long term about building for resiliency and rethinking design standards. But in a larger way, in a more universal way, are there the kinds of discussions you have along those lines?
Well, what we try to do is what we kind of say to people is expect the unexpected.
Right.
We're in uncharted territory, then we can expect for there to be kind of uncharted or unusual, maybe even unprecedented results. I would say I would submit that there's probably quite a few places on the lakeshore right now that never thought they would be in the situation they are now with these high lake levels, and every time even a typical, maybe even a weaker than normal storm comes through, then you get flooding in places like South Haven or Grand Haven or certainly over in the Metro Detroit area. There's a lot of neighborhoods that are dealing with long-term flooding conditions due to these high lake levels.
Oh, in the thumb area of Michigan,
Right, in the thumb area. I mean, really nowhere is immune. The Michigan, we talk a lot about how Michigan has just an incredible amount of coastline, which it does, and that's an incredible asset. But ironically, in this situation, it also means we have an incredibly large area of vulnerable and affected coastline.
Right. I mean, the Great Lakes and our beautiful inland lakes and streams and rivers, give us a great deal in terms of sheer beauty, but also recreational opportunities and, quality of life, but they also present unique challenges.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what we're finding is that even if you're not living along the lakeshore, or even if you don't live right along a river, you're still getting impacted. We talked to quite a few road commissions, for example, last summer who may have been planning projects, culvert replacements, whatever. Typically wouldn't have a whole lot of concerns about water, but then they put the first bucket in the ground, and holy cow, it's saturated. So it's a function of the rivers, yeah, the lake level, yeah, but really the local groundwater tables are rising as well, and that's harder to track. That's harder to put a number on, but certainly we've seen across a wide section of the state road commissions and other construction type projects having to deal with this when they typically would not be expecting to.
Well, Andy, your perspective has been really helpful to the conversation, so I appreciate it. Is there anything else we didn't touch on that you think is worth mentioning for now, knowing that this is going to be an ongoing conversation for quite some time?
Sure. Yeah, the only thing that I guess I would remind people again is, even though the snow is melted, we're not out of the woods for kind of our classic spring flooding. So usually that revolves around the rivers, but because we're in kind of this uncharted territory, there could be places that even if this spring unfolds in a pretty normal way, the lake levels are so high that there's places that could experience flooding that usually don't. So really it's a word of caution and preparedness, and just kind of paying extra attention for anybody who is along a waterway or recreates along a waterway. It's definitely the season, a very vulnerable season for Michigan right now while we transition into the spring.
Okay, thank you again. That was Andy Dixon, a hydrologist with the National Weather Service in Grand Rapids. For the second half of this week's podcast, I'll be talking with Brad Wieferich, who is the Director of the Bureau of Development at MDOT and the first two-time participant in the Talking Michigan Transportation podcast. So, Brad, thanks a lot for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it.
Appreciate being here, Jeff.
And the reason I've asked Brad on is because high water is such a concern everywhere across the state, obviously on the coast, but not just really on the lake shores, east and west, but also the inland lakes. And when the governor convened a high water summit a couple of weeks ago and had all the state agencies that are touched by this, Department of Agriculture, obviously, Eagle, DNR, MDOT, we quickly found out afterwards that a lot of the questions, a lot of the interest from media was on how this high water is affecting the transportation system. The most tangible way that people can relate to this is if it affects, their commute. So Brad kind of became the point person for MDOT talking to me. He's done a number of interviews since then, and we're going to talk about some of the questions he's been answering and how MDOT hopes to be able to react to this. But let's start with that, Brad. It's very difficult to know what this means long term and how we should react, if at all, right?
Yeah, that is the upwards of $100 million question right now is, are we seeing the new normal? That's the question that it's quite honestly very tough to say what's going to happen next. But we can see what's been happening over the last few years. You'd mentioned the High Water Summit, and there was some very good data and information provided by the Weather Service that really showed how wet we really are in the Great Lakes and how long-term this has been. If you look at periods of time going back from today, the past year, the past 3 years, the past 5 years, we are in the wettest period of each of those right now. So there is just a great abundance of water right now in the Great Lakes.
So we know that the water levels spiked in the mid-80s, like 86, 87 range, right? And were tremendously high then. In some cases, maybe higher than what we've seen now. So some people are going to dismiss this as a lot of hand-wringing over something that's very cyclical. And it was clear at the summit that the folks there from the National Weather Service and from the Army Corps of Engineers didn't want to weigh in on the hot-button political question of climate change, but they did frame the facts around what's going on right now and what's gone on basically the last 10 years with rainfall, really.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you mentioned, the mid-'80s when water levels were so high, immediately after they peaked, we ended up with a drought, 87, 88, in that time frame. We had very little rain. It brought us back to more normal lake levels, and the issue essentially went away. Well, it didn't go away forever. The water has been falling now for the last 5 to 10 years in the Great Lakes, continues to increase. And the trend right now, obviously we can't extrapolate and say that this is just going to continue exactly the way it is. But at this point, with what we're seeing so far in 2020, it doesn't look like there's going to be much of a change, at least in the decreased levels.
So your bureau, the Bureau of Development, means that you guys are responsible for design of projects. If it stops with you to try to think about if we're going to design a rebuild, because we're not really building anything new, but if there's a stretch of road, and we know things now that maybe we didn't know 50 or 60 years ago when that road was originally built, you try to take those things into account. But we're still in a challenged funding environment, even with the bond money that's going to make its way into the system and advance some projects over the next 4 or 5 years. We're still not anywhere where we need to be in terms of sustainable funding and what we want to do long term. How do you factor that into the high water?
Well, that's the nearly $100 million question that we're considering right now. So we've got some preliminary ideas of what our risk and impacts could be if this is the new normal. I've talked before about we're spending nearly $5 million today just to address the issues that we're dealing with at about 40 places around the state. But depending on what ultimately happens, these numbers could be $100 million and up if we have to raise roads, if we have to move roads, just simply reconstructing and dealing with the drainage systems themselves.
And moving roads could mean buying right-of-way.
Oh, absolutely.
Buying property.
Physically moving them further inland to escape some of the impacts. But the deal here is, for myself and my colleagues around the state, is there's no magic pot of money that's going to pay for this. We've already talked about the challenges that we have with our existing money, even with the bond money. There's no new money that would come to help us with this.
What about federal funding?
There's really no other pot of federal funding either. The only way that we could get into federal funding would be if there was an emergency declared by the state, by the federal government, to get FEMA money or some other emergency money, but that's not likely at this point.
So Benton Harbor, let's use that as kind of a ground zero for this. The U.S. Business 31, which is the main business route through the city of Benton Harbor, is very close to the lake. Lake Michigan is high, and it's basically overflowing, and it's causing flooding on the roadway and even into the parking lot at Whirlpool, which is a major Southwest Michigan employer. We're going to have to make some changes there and do what we can and figure out short-term and long-term. Like you said, is this the new normal? It's hard to say, but the region, the Southwest region, MDOT Southwest region, is going to have to figure out how to do that now with existing revenue. It's not like there's any new money that's going to solve the problem.
Yeah, exactly. and since this would be the priority, you're very likely going to see jobs that will have to be deferred. Projects that are currently in our 5-year program would have to be moved out in order to pay for some of these things.
So something that maybe was going to be rebuilt is going to be a maintenance job just to patch the pavement again, which is what we've had to do in several areas because of funding for several years, and this is just that's going to eat into those funds basically.
Yeah, that's all we have. I mean, the money that we're spending today has been out of our maintenance budgets. So anything that we're spending now obviously limits our ability to do any of our normal summer maintenance that we would do, pothole patching, etc. We've been able to handle it with just that maintenance piece. But once we start getting into more long-term permanent fixes to address a potential new normal, that's when it's going to start eating into our normal road and bridge program and potentially projects that we already have on the books to do.
So break this down as the basics. I mean, you're the head of the Bureau of Development now, but you've done lots of things in engineering and lots of things at MDOT, so you have a background in pavement management too. Talk about why water is such a threat to roads and bridges.
Obviously, we try to build our road bases to be as dry and stable as possible. They're purposely designed with aggregate bases and sand bases so that the water that comes down through the pavement infiltrates and gets out of there to maintain the integrity of that base.
Which is why sand is the best soil to build on.
Yeah, exactly. Sand and stone, and in some cases, on many of our larger routes, we'll put in under drains themselves to actually drain that base and get the water away. When you start looking at a road like Benton Harbor that you mentioned, when the water levels are so high that the water table itself is within that road base, there's no place for the water to go. So it sits and saturates the base, making it unstable.
And what's that do, even if the road isn't flooded so that you have to literally close it and detour people, what's it do to the pavement long term?
Well, obviously, the more loading on an unstable base is going to deteriorate the pavement. You're going to see cracking. You're going to see some failures in there just because of the instability of the bases below, because they're full of water.
So far, we've had a mild winter. It's early March. I mean, we could still get some real winter before the end of this month or even into April. It's happened. But let's assume that it plays out the way it has so far, and this turns out to be a mild winter. We still could have a horrendous pothole season, and that's because of the water, right? Absolutely. Frost has been a little bit less of an issue, but there still is frost in the ground, and when the frost comes out and there's an abundance of water that can't drain, again, you're it's going to
simply
freeze, and it's going to expand. And
Exactly.
As we look ahead, and I think everybody felt like the first thing you need to do is identify the problem, and that's why the governor convened what she did, and you guys got some really good information from the National Weather Service and from the Army Corps of Engineers. Whether it's Eagle or DNR or Agriculture or MDOT, there's a little bit of frustration with everybody, right? Because you kind of like, we know what the problem is, what we don't know is the solution, and we don't know long term if this is going to continue or not.
Right. That, again, that's the biggest question right now that we need to tackle. I've talked in terms of our short-term exposure and our long-term exposure, and that long-term really depends on what happens next. The last thing we're going to want to do is shut down a roadway. Obviously, that's a risk proposition for us. It's mobility issues for the drivers. We got to take all of those things into account when we decide what fix are we going to do? In some cases out there around the state, we have sandbags and pumps right now that are keeping roads open.
Right. I think specifically we know about Whitehall and Montague in Muskegon County.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's what we're doing today. That's not a long-term fix.
Yeah.
If the clouds part and the sun comes out for the summer, and we have a situation like we did in the later 80s, we may not have to consider that bigger $100 million fix, but we just don't know what that is right now. And from the trends that we're seeing, there's nothing to say that this isn't going to at least be a many-year issue for us to deal with.
So in simplest terms, if Lake Erie now is 52 inches higher than its average, I mean more than 4 feet above its average. If that had been the level in the early 60s or even the 50s when I-75 from Toledo going north through Monroe County, which is basically sitting on the soil that is Lake Erie, if we had known that then, they would have built it higher, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Anytime we design and build a roadway, we're using the best available information that we have at the time. And at that time, that was the lake level. That seemed to be the norm. So that's what we built for. And it serviced us for many years. Again, if our normal has changed, through no fault of MDOT, mind you,
right. Right.
then now we have a problem that we have to deal with again that we would have never foreseen.
So what have you learned about this while you've been at it with the Corps in terms of who really does? It's in simplest terms. They used to talk about the IJC turning the spigot. I don't know if that's really not it's not that simple, but are there policies and things that these federal agencies can do that alter lake levels?
There are, and there's some diversions that are out there as options. However, they've already looked at them, and any of the regulatory type things that they can do would only affect the water level by a few centimeters. So it's not like we have the ability to open the gates and let everything run down the St. Lawrence Seaway and put us back to a normal, quote-unquote, lake level. It's just not possible.
So this is one of those problems that we shouldn't look at curing. We just need to look at managing.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're doing. That's a great word. We're managing our risk right now. We're addressing the most critical issues. We're keeping our roads open. We're doing the smart fixes that we can at the moment. Somewhat hedging our bets to see what the next thing comes. But, sandbags and pumps, again, is not a long-term issue. That should
solution,
be, a long-term solution, exactly. That's not something we're going to want to run with for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
So it's going to be a very interesting spring. It's going to be a very interesting next few months to see where this is really going.
And this is going to be a priority for your bureau and the people that work in the environmental section and try to, as best they can, plan and design around it.
Sure. You brought up planning and designing around it, and at MDOT we're very big into asset management and planning and in our 5-year program and putting together what we think will maximize our resources, maximize our investment over that long term. When things like this pop up, all that has to change.
Yeah.
We change our priorities. We have to change the criticality, and that kind of speaks back to what we mentioned earlier. If this is our new normal and I'm having to use money to relocate and raise roads and deal with storm sewer systems, there's other work that we plan to do to help our overall system condition that simply aren't going to get done.
Does that flexibility and nimbleness come naturally to engineers?
Some. I'll leave that one alone.
All right, well, thanks for taking the time to do this. We're going to be talking more about this over the next probably, year and more, so I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Jeff.
Okay, thanks again for listening to this week's edition of Talking Michigan Transportation, and I want to give a special thanks to Corey Peedy, who does the sound engineering for the podcast, and to Sarah Martin of MDOT, who does the show's intro and closing.
That's a wrap for this edition of Talking Michigan Transportation. Check out show notes and more on SoundCloud or by subscribing on Apple Podcasts.